4. The Iron Harbor. Besipalabuhan's sprawl arched around much of the southern rim of the Iron Harbor, from the lower west banks eastward to encompass the delta of the Tamingung River, a full 100 miles of tangled street and market and canal. But the numberless buildings were, for the most part, not growing skyward with the advent of easily available steel and concrete and crane, as those in Tepeklan or Maijing. The houses and eateries and places of worship were, with modification for the humming wires and plumbing of modernity, nearly all exactly as they would have been centuries before. The storied histories of this or that clan, along with Lautani connection to the energy, as they saw it, residing in long-occupied places, meant they took great care in maintaining the outlines and nuances of structures they called theirs, regardless of the changes playing out about them. Many of its cramped streets might now play host to automobiles constructed on the foreign model of Sholoshaishan or Guang manufacture, and all of its ancient slipways and shipyards might now belch the smoke and fume of weld and furnace. But at its core, the city was an ancient organism, and one felt that age stepping out into its chaotic, shaded streets. The Sea Mother's Way, down at the harbor front of the city, housed the teeming central rail station of Besipalabuhan in those days, and it was here that the men of Tujuhdanau found themselves woken by whistle and crowd, and the rumbling whine of their doors being rolled open. Berani, as many of them, had slept clean through their trip. It wasn't as if the makeshift cargo cars the youngest were in had windows to look out of, but his first thought on becoming aware of his surroundings at the shouts of summons outside was a lament that he had missed the descent into the city. But if Berani feared he would not be awed by the scale and sprawl of the Iron Harbor and the beating heart of the Duumvirate, he was soon relieved of those worries. Stepping out onto the hectic scramble of the platform with his pack dangling from one hand and his eyes reeling from the sudden onset of afternoon sunlight after so many hours comatose in the thundering dark, he found the city was, if anything, even more impressive from below. It was tiered, as many Lautani ports built in its image, set into a great series of cliffs about the coast, and descending in stepped levels until it was even with the shore. Up above, along that highest tier, was the fall of the Great Snake River, where the waterway tumbled down into the bowels of the fabled Temple of the Sea, a vast structure of marble and lapis engraved with great reliefs of aquatic currents and depictions of the deary handmaidens of Laut. It rose from amidst that forest of architecture built by Lautani hand as if the Maiden of the Oceans herself sat aloft to watch the doings of her folk, and the golden cats and fish and sea beasts which decorated the crests of its spired roof glittered distant in the sun. From its front gate poured the dregs of the Great Snake, which fed the slow-moving canals of the city as it traced its way from tier to tier down to the sea. It was the most sacred place in all of storied Jalawa, and matched in the Duumvirate only by the temple to Gazurgu, on the slopes of the slumbering volcano Kingarian on the vast, wild island of Banting, across the Jalawa Channel. Before he could truly drink in the splendor of that temple on the heights overlooking the lower rungs of Besipalabuhan, dazed and dumbstruck as he was, there were 2 older men before him. They were certainly not of the Tujuhdanau muster, evident not only by their accents, but by their slightly unkempt appearance. One was willowy and shirtless, and the other was stooped with eyes reddened by liquor, or something else. "You must be here from the provinces," the leaner of them said, grin wide and disarming. "Come up for the fight with the others? What province are you from, brother?" "Yes," Berani said tentatively, looking around him and seeing that most of the others of his car were already drifting off toward an empty span of their vast platform to gather with the rest of the new arrivals. "From Tujuhdanau." Gazorgu go with you, the lean stranger said. You look tired. Must have been a long way. Let Turuk and I carry your bag. It's the least a couple of old Kurja caste boys like us could do for a new soldier. Berani was disarmed by the warmth in the man's voice. He was not so naive, however, given the strange appearance of the two men, to just hand over his bag. But when the strangers asked him to single out where his people were gathered in the throng about them, and he observed the painfully thin, shirtless one long enough to see he hobbled as he moved, he supposed it wasn't likely the uncoordinated pair would try and steal the pack in a chase. He felt bad for mistrusting them as the man rattled off a quick-fire story about how one of his best friends never came home from Hurabaya in the last war, and how lucky he was to have been born to a caste unburdened by war, and so on. And in the end, Berani gave the bag to him, not wishing to offend, and followed behind as the two strangers led him at a slow pace over to join amongst the others. But while they might not have been bag thieves, their scheme, and their slick practice in it, became evident to him when they arrived at their destination, and they lingered near him after returning the bag, hinting that they were hungry, and that a karang or two, the temple-printed currency of the Isles, would carry them a long way. I don't carry any karang, Berani told them. I never have. The only people who do up in Tujuhdanau are the people down on the low lakes that meet outsiders with goods. Well, I just figured since we helped you out and you seem so happy to be welcomed, you might be able to find some, the willowy man said. Some of the others might have some. If you could ask around with your friends, I'd appreciate it. The request was still framed in an affable, slightly jovial way, but there was no mistaking the hungry pressure behind it now. Not that Berani feared the two men. Part of the reason why he'd allowed them to move his bag in the first place was precisely because they looked half asleep on their feet, like they'd both tumbled to the earth in a strong breeze. But he could not talk his way away from the pair, and as he tried to apologize and thank them for their help and sidle sideways towards Pahala through the crowd, they followed, pushing deep into the milling Tujuhdanau men and continuing to call after him in amused but irritated tones, as if they'd been interrupted in a business transaction. Some friends of yours from back home? The willowy one was saying as he came upon Pahala and Samudra. Fancy that. Either of you got a couple karang to spare? We helped your comrade out getting over the platform, but he seems a little light. Berani was beginning to protest, as Pahala and Samudra, sensing something was off, both began themselves to, again, likely truly, insist they carried no money. But before another leg of the awkward game could be played, Rajabayani had appeared from nowhere from amidst the crowd of Tujuhdanau men, and was looming over the pair, hand on his revolver. This is my battalion, he said, and you aren't in it. Move to another part of the platform or I'll shoot you dead and drag you out. Of course, Highness, the lean one said, head bobbing as he saw the crest on the new arrival's turban. I meant no offense, of course. They melted into the crowd beyond the Tujuhdanau muster, with the practiced ease of stalking feral cats. Rajabayani looked down at Berani, his face still obscured behind his ribukedok, while his cold eyes spoke all that needed to be spoken. But with all the men of Berani's age arrayed around him and suddenly gazing their way, he did not scold aloud, and like the two hucksters, disappeared into the mass to be among the elders again. Pahala waited until he was certain the Raja was out of earshot amidst the clamor, asking, "What the hell was that about?" "Just shit I should have been wiser to," Berani said. "A scam. Offered to carry the bag and then acted like they needed paying for it. You have any idea where we're headed to train?" "No," Pahala said. "Your guess is as good as mine." "They'll take us up to the upper tier," Agama chimed in, not far from them in the crowd. He pushed over, pointing up towards the Temple of the Sea, saying, "There's a temple to Gazorgu to the side up there, small by comparison. That's where they'll put us up while we train." "You've been cycled through before, right?" Pahala asked, What's it like up there?" "Rough," Agama said. "My legs are still sore from the walk down to Parampatawa, and if prior experience is anything to go by, we're going to be right back at it tomorrow. Day after, if we're lucky." "I don't know if I'll last if they throw us in that quick," Samudra said, his eyes still locked on the distant temple. "You will as long as you don't give up," Agama said. "They're trying to make you miserable, because we've got much worse waiting for us up north. You have to learn to get spiteful about it if you want to slide through." They went quiet for a time after that, Agama smoking and the others drinking water in the hither and thither tides of people on the platform. The Raja and his underlings seemed to be in heated conversation with temple priests and priestesses of the sun or sea, respectively. Other trains were rolling in, most disgorging men dressed in the black and white and blue of the Navy, and a few disgorging common passengers. One, far off on another platform, was unloading blue and teal-clad marine men like themselves, likely from Mahalawa in the east. Mahalawa, Tujuhdanau, and Parampatawa were the only landlocked provinces on Jalawa, and thus the only ones from which marines were levied. With Parampatawa almost certainly having sent its sons to the capital days earlier due to its proximity to telegraph and rail, Berani could take some comfort in the face of the fact that Tujuhdanau had not been the last to arrive. "At least we beat Mahalawa here," he said, "even if only just." After an hour's lingering, the elder soldiery were whipping the line into shape again and dragging their charges back into an ordered column. Raja Bayani again took his place resplendent at the head of his men, and then led the march of their bedraggled lines up through Besipalabuhan to the temple district above. It was near dusk by then, most of the day having been spent on the rails, and the streets through which Berani walked in the light of the bulbs which blinked on across the metropolis were beautiful and alien beyond his wildest dreams. The march through the city took them up away from the warehouses and smoky factories of the seaside shipyards and through old stone avenues girded with ivy and vine and shade tree. Dodging traffic on the roads available to sputtering open-topped car or truck, many of which were halted for the 1,000 new-come Tujuhdanau men to pass, Berani's ears were assailed with the drone of horn or chime or bell, and the raucous shouts of selling or argument. There were elephant-drawn carts moving goods, and crowds of children pilfering stalls on roadsides. There were paper men shouting news about naval engagements in the South Sea, and there were young roadside priests of the Temple of Gazurgu officiating disputes or arresting wrongdoers for interrogation. And among them walked foreigners, more than Berani, who had never laid eyes on a kindred other than his own, could ever have hoped to see. He had seen images of Ug, of course. They were often present in temples of Gazurgu, but lion folk made up near a tenth of those wandering the streets of the Duumvirit's capital, and the towering stature and strange accents of them rang out as they shopped or laughed or yelled their anger. But there were also other, less familiar, and less inspiring, folk. A gaggle of 4 hulking Medvedi half-clad in the strange furred garb of their homeland, their ursine jaws flapping as they grunted in their alien dialect, came squeezing out of an undersized bathhouse to watch them pass. A Guang, perhaps a diplomat, in vibrant red silks not terribly unlike his own, hurried down an alley entrance to an opulent Middle District home hung with the crimson colors of his distant kingdom as they passed. This lone exemplar of the tiger folk was trailing a string of Lautani attendants behind him, seeming wiry and slightly clumsy despite his size and the ferocity of his visage. There was, as the Anayaks back home had claimed, a small and shady district of tall and silent Miawai slithering to and fro about their business on the rung of Besipalabuhan just beneath the great temple. their homes lit with the fey violet fires which spoke to the presence of their much-feared priests. And as dark set in and the last stubborn lights in the city turned off, and the whole sprawl became a cavalcade of blinking signage and stark pooled glows from street lamps, they passed a rowdy, open-fronted bar whose entire clientele were almost as slight and lean as Lautani, the Vulpine sons of Sion, from the far side of the New World across the western seas. They plucked stringed instruments and danced to shrieking fiddles, and threw darts at painted boards, and cackled at men so drunk they'd fallen over en route to the barman for refills. "Foxfolk," Pahala said beside him. "They're not with us, are they?" "Not in their country," Agama piped in, both quiet to spare the ears of the third line. "They needn't have bothered, though. Their words were lost in the thrum of the city about them. But there's a lot of Sion in the Sholoshaishan colonies, out west in the mountains, who aren't happy with their place in the Empire. Papers say they're going to rise up and help us when the time comes." Pahala raised an eyebrow, seemingly incredulous, looking back over his shoulder at the wild bunch as they passed. They scaled the stairs to the city's holiest tier, and traversed the bridges of the great aquatic gardens which fronted the Temple of the Sea. Rays and water serpents and luminescent fish darted about in a bright series of pools lit from below by some connivance of either Laut's magics or else clever electrical work by the priesthood. Berani was reminded painfully of home, for the overhanging trees and flower gardens lining the causeways were glowing and vibrant in the dark. The sound of running water was constant in the city as an undertone to the traffic and voices and chaos, and in some small way, the reassuring presence of it brought comfort to him in so strange and jarring an environment. But any comfort he did find in the gardens of Laut was stolen when they passed the gilded entrance of the temple proper, and he saw the company which was leaving the temple through the main gate. Raja Bayani had to pull up his column to a halt to let the strange mob pass, and much as he wished it were not the case, Berani had a great deal of time to look at them beneath the stark lights of the temple grounds. What in the world are those? Berani did not realize he had spoken aloud, his hair on end and his nose upraised. There was a strange hint of decay poorly hidden on the air, of sickly scents masked with sweet perfumes, or else of long rotten jungle wood turned over to the open sky, the metallic stink of wet rot, surrounded by the sweetness of flowers. "Couldn't tell you," Agama said ahead of him. He was staring too, seemingly just as repulsed as Berani. "Olospid, they're called," Samudra's voice said from behind him. Fresh off his rotation in Besipalabuhan, he had not been as on edge as many of the others during their rock up through the tiers. But he was on edge now, familiar or not. "I've never seen so many of them before." These Olospid, as Samudra had described them, were not large, standing below chest height on a Lautani man. The tallest of them was perhaps 4 feet in height, and they gave the impression of being almost weightless. This was partly due to the grotesquely thin and tapering build of their bodies, but was aided by the fact they were all garbed in long, flowing black robes, which masked the motions of whatever feet tramped across the causeway beneath. They kept their hands tucked into the sleeves of these robes, like priestesses moving from service to chamber, but it was evident, whatever their hands might look like, that the creatures had 2 sets of arms. Their heads were low, necklace things emerging from their sweeping collars, with many clustered eyes over a pair of great spider's fangs set in swollen red chitin that clashed with the dark hues of the rest of the awful face. There were 80 of them, Samudra would later swear, walking close together but not keeping any recognizable formation. The things clicked and clattered and whistled and wheezed amongst themselves, and though this must have been some semblance of speech, Berani could recognize no form or flow of grammar or syllable in it. Berani found himself speaking aloud without intending to again, as if his turning innards were demanding answers of him, and he were mechanically relaying the words to his comrades in the column. Spiderfolk aren't real, are they? Anymore, I mean. Well, they're real enough, obviously, Samudra said. He did not sound pleased by the notion. We used to see one or two now and then when they'd visit the temple to have audience with the high priestess. Horrible sight to round a corner on in the lower temple grounds after dark. But at least the smell usually betrays them early. Agama, up till now unshakable, asked, "Where are they from?" "I don't know, rightly," Samudra said. "But the priestess in charge of my group said she heard they were from below our colonies, down in Baru Lautan. Must have been a nasty shock to meet them for the first time down there. The priesthoods keep it hushed up, but they're supposedly on our side. They've got no love for the Shaishans, obviously." "The Shaishans wiped them out because the spider folk stabbed them in the back, Father told me," Berani said. "Thousands of years ago. Not exactly a people you'd want to trust, even if it is against the Shaishans." "Well," Agama put in from his place up ahead, "it's not exactly like we have choices, is it? We'll have to take everything we can get, I suppose." When the Alospid had passed and descended to the lower city, Raja Bayani led them on. They rounded the mountainous temple of the sea, and in its shadow found the blazing peak of the temple grounds of Gazorgu. It was small and cowed next to its larger sibling, but divorced from the mighty structure beside it, it would have made a grand sight in itself. Dryland plants from Gunug and pouring flowers on vine or branch spilled from its gardens, and in its gold and blue painted walls there was something of the architecture of the lion folk about it. A few Oog attendants and holy men milled about the grounds, but the priesthood of the sun god was, for the most part, Lautani, just, Berani supposed, as the priestesses of Laut and Gunug must mostly be comprised of lion folk. They wound into the west reaches of the grounds, where Raja Bayani met with some of the notables of the priesthood, the details of their talk lost on those in the back lines. For a time the column stood waiting once more, able to gaze out over the tumult of Besipalabuhan before them, undistracted by stench or sight. And Berani saw the waters of the harbor beyond were studded with the dark forms of great steel ships, and the skies overhead were illuminated with great spotlights from below, which panned the expanse of sparse cloud and muted star in a search whose aim he did not know. "They put those in the year I first came here," Samudra explained, pointing out towards the nearest of the skyward lights. "There's some sort of worry the Shaishans might come from the air. Hard to get the legions over here in those little planes they have," Marek observed from behind. "Have you seen those pictures of the sky fortresses they have?" Agama asked. "In the papers? Large as a battleship, I read. Like armored balloons or something of that sort. They've got the Volvine making the things for them in the New World, just like their planes. And supposedly they fly too high for our planes to go up and get at them, unless they choose to come down. Who knows how many they have like that? I'd bet you could fit a fair number on those." "Besides," Samudra added, "they could use them for bombs, too. Might not even need men to do real harm. The whole city organized fire brigades from the lower castes last year, preparing." And suddenly the whole of the metropolis below him seemed a great blazing signboard for assault to Berani, even with the unbreakable navy out upon the water, or the coastal forts which supposedly barred entry to the harbor afar out beyond sight. The prospect of untouchable Jalawa coming under attack was made real to him. He had never seen so much as a picture of one of these sky fortresses, as Agama described them, but his mind painted far more horrible outlines of them than any grainy black and white reprint ever could. The men of Tujuhdanau were soon herded into a broad barracks of cold stone and ancient wire cots in the dark innards of the temple. They were shown their boundaries and introduced to the bathing and privy facilities, 8 shower stalls and 10 seats on a trough bench to be shared by 1,000 men. Training would, Raja Berani announced, begin the day after tomorrow, on the 3rd of Metzli. Until then, breakfast, lunch, and dinner would be provided at dawn, midday, and dusk by the priesthood of Gazurgu. The men were not to leave their quarters unless given permission for medical attention by an elder, whereupon they would be escorted to the Temple of the Sea for treatment if their own trained medics were not sufficient to tend any illness. The allotment of rank and gear would be conducted by the Raja in the morning, but he made clear that room for advancement was available to those who distinguished themselves during training. Their preparation would be 4 weeks, shorter than usual, but expedited to ensure their arrival in Gunug would not come too late. They were given leave to smoke, so long as they did this in the court of the temple and troubled no priests, and then told they were free to rest at ease for the remainder of the night. But the legs and backs of the men were still sore from the night march, and their minds, as filled as they were with the chaos of the capital through which they'd walked, were nearing collapse under exhaustion. Berani took his bunk among most of the younger Pajuang men, stowed his worn sandals and kit beneath it as they'd been told, and like many of his fellows, spent some minutes writing a letter to his mother he figured he could send later, telling her he'd arrived. He was asleep before an hour passed. Their rise would come painfully early tomorrow.